Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. A very warm welcome to all of you. I, Shivangi Singhal from IIIDEM ECI, feel privileged to introduce to you the moderators and panelists of today's session on sustainable finance for EMBs and cost of elections. I think I should skip the first three slides to avoid repetition. As we know, a brief introduction of the topic. This session explores sustainable and impartial election financing as critical democratic infrastructure that safeguards the independence, professionalism, and efficiency of election management bodies. Participants will examine how transparent and predictable budgeting frameworks strengthen fiscal autonomy and reduce risks arising from short-term funding cycles, rising costs, and political interference. Drawing on international financing models and accountability practices, the session promotes long-term planning approaches that position election funding as a strategic investment in democratic stability. Through policy development, participants will build capacity to advocate for sustainable funding mechanisms, strengthen accountability, and enhance institutional resilience to reinforce electoral integrity and public trust. I will now be introducing you to the panelists. We have Ms. Teres Pierce Lalena. Ma'am has been recognized for experience across field, headquarters, and policy levels of electoral administration. She was appointed as a founding staff member of International IDEA and later as Assistant Director of the Democracy Program at the Carter Center. Through IIP's UNDP and IDEA publications and the Bridge curriculum were developed, including the AIMS Electoral Knowledge Network. First 12 elections were organized in Mozambique in 1994 and Cambodia's first multi-party elections were supervised in 1992-93. Long-standing service as a presiding officer in Swedish elections has been performed alongside observation missions in Africa, Europe, and Asia for major organizations worldwide today. Mr. Oliver Joseph, Advisor Electoral Processes Program. Mr. Oliver Joseph has been serving as an advisor in the Electoral Processes Program at International IDEA, where research and technical assistance on electoral management, electoral systems, and absentee voting has been overseen. On electoral integrity and electoral processes have been produced and contributed to by him. Extensive electoral assessments have been conducted, including participation as a seconded technical expert and as an election analyst and observer in missions across Eastern Europe, Central Asia, and Latin America. Prior to joining International IDEA, registration, ballot design, and postal voting processes were managed for local bodies in the United Kingdom, while government programs in East Africa and Eastern Europe were coordinated at international development finance institutions. We have Mr. Elvis Jones, Commissioner of Electoral Commission Seychelles. Sir was appointed Director of the James R. Mankin Peace and Diplomacy Research Institute on 29th of October 2025, bringing over 3 decades of experience in educational leadership, institutional management, and governance. He holds a master's degree in education management and policy studies, a bachelor's degree in education honors, and an advanced diploma in science education. He previously served as registrar of the University of Seychelles, where he played a key role in institutional development, quality assurance, performance management, and human resource strategy. In his current role, Mr. Julie provides strategic leadership to advance peace and diplomacy research, strengthen academic collaboration, and support national and regional research priorities. We have with us Ms. Shubha Saxena, ma'am, Director of ECI. Ma'am is Senior Administrative Service Officer and presently serving with the Election Commission of India. An engineer by training, I am graduate from the Indian Institute of Technology, Roorkee, before joining the civil services. Ms. Saxena served as district magistrate and in senior leadership roles at the state and national levels and is closely associated with key aspects of election management in India. Her insights on managing elections at scale, strengthening institutional capacity, and deepening democratic trust are in this global context. Thank you so much. Now, may I request to please take over? Thank you. I'm sorry. May I now welcome Ms. Teres ma'am to please share her inputs on the topic. Thank you.
How lovely to be with you again on this third, last but not least day. I'm going to run you through a little bit of the history of why at International IDEA, where I have the great honor of leading the electoral processes portfolio, why we think that the financing of elections is so important, where it belongs in our own history, and why we've chosen it as one of the kind of pillar work themes for the Indian chairmanship this year, the work that we will be doing together across the year that comes. So this goes back a while, 30 years ago, around the founding of International IDEA. The electoral management bodies of the member states of IDEA gathered at the headquarters at Strömsborg in Stockholm. And one of the questions that was asked, important issue that you think that International IDEA should work with. Now remember, these were the early days and it was a blank slate. And while many things came up, there were different activities to get to what was the main thing that they wanted IDEA to work on. And of all the different topics that came up, from accurate voter registration, voter education, voting operations, electoral system design, the one that rose that was common to all was the cost of elections. Okay. And then when we thought, how do we plan a work program around that? It actually wasn't easy. What are you supposed to do with that topic? Are you supposed to compare it? Well, comparing is really hard. And here's a little anecdote about that first session of gathering the electoral management bodies. The word electoral management body at that time didn't exist. What existed were disparate ways of organizing elections in different countries. We had an extraordinary powerful election commission, as we still do in India, but also in some countries in Latin America. After the dictatorships, there was a strong sense in Latin America of never again. And so extremely strong tribunals were put in place. They're called tribunals in many countries in Latin America. So the Supreme Tribunal with judges presiding and a sense of a fourth branch of government and a real clout, as there is here in India. We also had election commissions emerging from a post-apartheid or post-conflict Africa in our member state portfolio. And then we had Europe with ministries of finance and some tiny unit responsible with civil servants responsible for organizing something, not realizing that their portfolio was anything special. It was just part of normal work. And I can give the example of Sweden, where elections at that time, the election management body was a tiny unit inside Ministry of Interior, no, the tax department. So a little unit in the tax department. And so when we were going to gather all of these different ones, like who is the central body responsible in places as different as the Australian Election Commission, very strong, very experienced, competence inside, same with Canada, but also ones where as in Sweden or in Denmark or Norway, it was really civil servants who had perhaps only had that portfolio for a little while, but the systems were so established that they could just slip into them as a civil servant and then slip out when it was done. And also remember, it was so decentralized in much of Europe that the work was really done, or as in the UK, at the local level, and that's where the competencies lay. So what was it that was, when we were going to organize that first one, what was it we were bringing together? We couldn't call it election commissions. What was the name that was going to be something that held all of these things together? And it was an extremely clumsy name. We thought election, well, what do they all do? Election management, okay. And then agencies and then we just put bodies in there. And that remained, and it just makes me so chuffed when I'm wandering around here and hearing people talking about EMBs as if it was the most normal thing in the world. But that little anecdote tells you something about why comparing the cost of elections is absolutely meaningless. Another reason why comparing was absolutely meaningless at that time was that we had countries emerging from absolute infrastructural ground zero. Think of Mozambique and Cambodia having elections for the first time, destroyed bridges, destroyed infrastructure, traumatized population. So to organize those first elections to emerge from terrible conflict meant actually rebuilding the communication and transport infrastructure. And here the donor community played a huge role. So when we think about money in elections, we also have to think about the role of the donor community. In many places, countries pay for their own elections, but from the 90s and onwards, and this is not going to be the case moving forward, but actually donor funding was a big part of the financing portfolio. And this also made comparison very difficult because if you are thinking of a Mozambique where you're bringing in helicopters to transport election materials, or you're thinking about a Mozambique 10 years later when there were no helicopters and you had to do it, yourself with what you had as donor funding went down. So another entry point, if comparing is difficult, was how much should it cost or how do you lower the cost of elections? Like considering what you have, how can you cut the cost of elections? When these election management bodies spoke of this being a priority area, a lot of it was because, of course, of either the difficulty of knowing how to imagine what something would cost. Remember, this was a moment where and we're still in that moment, where the demands on election management bodies just keeps increasing. It doesn't go down. The things that you're being asked to do is ever increasing. So how do you cut? What would you cut? What would you take away if you've got this pressure to keep spending down? This is also difficult to make generic rules about because it depends on what is important. If you are in a situation where security matters, well, then you have to put money into security, and that's just the way it is. Or if you're in a case where you're emerging from apartheid and you've had people who have been disenfranchised for so long, then obviously voter education is your top priority. So there again, the possibility of taking some kind of generic rules, this 50 ways to cut the cost of your elections, was impossible. So what we ended up doing was saying it depends, and a project whereby we broke down the electoral process into its bits and just said, these are the choice points that you have, and these are the cost implications of those choice points. And that endeavor became the ACE project, which I hope many of you use, but it became the Encyclopedia of Elections online that up to now has been the place where if you Google something, that will be the results that you will get is from the ACE project. And it's now in the very safe hands of the Mexican Election Commission. The responsibility for the election, for the ACE project rotates. And I'm hoping that through our project this year, and with all the research that's being done, we can implement and we can inject some more into that 30-year endeavor or that 30-year repository of knowledge. So we've had this idea of financing bubbling, and you'll hear more about what we're getting to today. But we've it has accompanied this understandings of the mechanisms of financing, budgeting, and costing has accompanied the development and of the election management as a professional field. And just to say that many of these resources are available on our own website, which I hope that you use. We have many knowledge products, but we have tutorials on budgeting and costing there. And there's also, we've developed a bridge module. If those of you not using the Bridge project, it is an extraordinary resource. It is a training curriculum for election management that's used throughout the world, and including having been run here at IIIDEM. But one module on the cost of elections. We have also case studies and are moving towards a handbook, which we will hear more about in a minute. But aside from global knowledge products, capacity building tools that have accompanied the development of election administration as a profession, one thing that's extremely important for us is to help shape global norms. And never has that been more important than now. With the political pressures on election management body and the sense that it's open season for short-term political goals or foreign policy goals to be more important than the protection of the democracy, then never has it been more important to protect the financial mechanisms which are absolutely directly linked to the independence. And that is one of the core themes that will accompany the chairmanship of India, of International IDEA and our work program this year. And in that respect, we are trying to shape global norms, in part by working with the OECD, who work directly with financing institutions, reaching out to them and encouraging them to include this in their portfolio. But also through the Global Network for Securing Electoral Integrity, which is a global network of organizations that have emerged in this moment to try and develop global norms that are appropriate for this moment. And one of them is on the independence of election commissions. And one of them, the tenets of it is having the financial resources that you need to be set up to succeed and not set up to fail. I can also just do a plug for the model commitments for advancing genuine and credible elections, which says the same thing, that if you do not resource your election management bodies appropriately, then you are not following global norms. So this is upgrading the topic of financing in global norms is one of the priorities that we have moving forward. And with that, I will hand to my colleague Oliver to talk about how this field is developing and where we're thinking at the moment. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, the slideshow's there. So I will follow on from Therese's introduction to the topic. My presentation is going to be in 3 parts. So first of all, I'm going to talk about why financing is important. Just a very brief overview. Then I'll go on to talk a bit about the research that International IDEA is doing. And as Therese mentioned, there are different mechanisms. So as part of this, we're looking at some of the different mechanisms and models that exist, and this will form part of the new handbook. We've also done some research, and there are 6 case studies which will inform this handbook, which I'll talk a bit more about. And then I'll also talk about the type of costs. So not the costs per se, but some of the different types and how we can categorize them. So as we heard, financing the cost of elections is not new, but in many ways, the topic has accelerated in recent years. And I think that's partly because it's become more prominent as we recognize funding for EMBs is directly related to their independence and their autonomy. There's also this increasing need for cost effectiveness. As a public service in all countries, irrespective of region in the world, there's a need to make sure that public money is not wasted and spent well. Also, election costs are increasing. So that's another reason why this topic is important. But I think just to provide a brief outline. So election administration is a core function of the state. And this is something that we often overlook, but it's also worth remembering. It's also ongoing and non-discretionary. Funding for EMBs and electoral cycle activities must also be continuous, predictable, and institutionalized. It can't be occasional, and it shouldn't be treated as an exceptional expenditure. And this is too often the case in some countries. And this is what we'll go on to hear about when we look at some of the research that we've done and how some of the solutions to where it has been seen as an exceptional expense. Some countries are adopting solutions to evolve that, and we'll look at that in a moment. It's also important to understand that underfunding or delayed funding for election administration doesn't simply create operational inefficiencies. It risks non-compliance with national laws and sometimes even the Constitution. Of course, this isn't always the case. And it ultimately weakens democratic legitimacy of public institutions. So this very specific topic has a wider issue for the whole democratic governance architecture of a country. So for this reason, as I said, EMB and electoral activities should be treated as a mandatory public expenditure. And this is something that's really interesting that's come out in some of our research. So we need to treat it as spending for pensions or military or education. And this isn't always recognized. As I said, sometimes it's treated as a peripheral public expenditure, such as culture. But I think if we need to kind of shift that way of thinking, that mindset where it's non-negotiable. And then the one way of doing this is changing the way that it's accounted for in public budgets. So why does sustainable finance for EMBs matter? So from a public financial management perspective, election day is often seen as being confined, election delivery is often seen as being confined to election day. Although, as all of us know in this room, this is far from reality. One of the things that is needed is that policymakers, so we all, there are many EMBs at this conference here, and they understand the reality of delivering elections, but policymakers often don't. And this is something that we've encountered, this mindset, in some of our research. It's just that, so you'll have policymakers who sit on committees who deal with the budget for election funding, and they're just not aware of the multi-annual requirements and how 1 year's spending will be different to the next, or larger and smaller. So without sustainable financing arrangements, EMBs are forced to treat elections as one-off projects. This leads to emergency procurement, suboptimal contracting, higher unit costs, and erosion of institutional capacity. Whereas sustainable finance allows EMBs to plan across the entire cycle and deliver elections in a manner that are efficient and professional. Also, financial sustainability is central to operational independence of EMBs. And as we've been speaking about, and maybe I'm preaching to the converted, but legal independence isn't sufficient if an EMB has to rely on ad hoc disbursements or repeated negotiations to execute their mandate. So when funding is uncertain or delayed, the executive can gain indirect influence through control of the budget of the EMB, and also some of the activities that need to be implemented, be that by a central EMB or sometimes local other actors who implement electoral activities. And EMB decision-making can be driven by cash flow constraints rather than operational needs. And the public confidence in the neutrality of election delivery can be weakened. So, contrary, sustainable and predictable financing can remove the financial leverage from political actors. As we know, this is a case in some countries, not all, but some countries. And it can also protect the EMB during times of heightened political sensitivity. So this is my chance to plug some of the work that we're doing. So as you can see on the slideshow, these are 3 of 6 case studies that we've commissioned. It's not particularly interesting to look at, but hopefully it can stimulate some thinking. And if anyone's interested, I do encourage you to go to the International IDEAS website. And the reason why I've put these case studies on the slide is that it's related to a big piece of research that we're doing, which we started essentially about 5 years ago. It feels like a long time ago, but the topic is really deep. So we're developing a handbook on financing, looking at how essentially countries can finance EMBs, but also electoral activity costs more sustainably. And that's also, and it's from a 2-pronged approach to protect the independence, but also to make sure that countries can get the money that they need. And it's also, so as I said, the handbook's been going on for 5 years, but it's something that we hope to develop a lot more under International IDEA, India's chairship of International IDEA. And that's something that I'm quite excited about, but I know that my colleagues are as well. So now I'm going to move on to the second part of the presentation, which I outlined at the beginning. And I'm just going to give you a quick overview of some of the work that we've done so far. So what we're trying to do is, so a large part of the research that we're doing, which will form the handbook, is looking at different models and mechanisms that different countries adopt to finance their elections. And the hope is, of course, what we do at IDEA is a lot of it's comparative research. And sometimes you can't cross what's relevant in one country won't be relevant in another. Nevertheless, there are always examples that we can learn from. And that's something that we're hoping to draw out in our research. So we're trying to develop categorize some models. And crucially, going back to a point I made before, is that, what this the audience for this handbook will be hopefully policymakers, not more so than EMBs, but it should be of equal value to EMBs, because it's really policymakers who need to understand how the financing process works. So very quickly, as I said, different jurisdictions have different institutional arrangements, and this is largely often because of their political history, but they also have different legal systems and different public financial management systems. Nevertheless, each has the objective to enhance timely and guaranteed funding. So while we haven't identified a full set of models yet, there are 3 that we think we can categorize as different mechanisms. So I'll quickly outline them here, as you can see on the slide. So first of all, there's the hybrid model. So it's quite technical. So unless you're an accountant or a public financial management expert, I apologize, but as I said, hopefully this can stimulate some thinking to explore further. So the hybrid model, this combines annual parliamentary appropriations with additional standing statutory authorizations for some core functions. And the objective of this is to ensure funding continuity continues, but it also preserves the oversight function. The second model is the statutory model, and this provides guaranteed automatic funds for the election delivery. And then a third model is what we're currently calling innovative models. And these are either trust funds or escrow accounts. And this is particularly relevant in countries where money is tight. So I haven't listed the countries on my slide, but I'm going to talk a bit about, I'm going to name the countries. So the hybrid statutory appropriation model, the hybrid model. So an example here is Australia. So the Australian Election Commission operates under this hybrid financing system, whereby most election delivery costs are approved through the annual parliamentary appropriation process. But at the same time, legislation allows for as I said, the standing appropriations. And this can fund electoral roll maintenance or other non-core costs, which I'll come on to talk about in a moment. And so from a governance perspective, this model balances fiscal oversight by Parliament and operational continuity for core mandated functions. And now I'll just quickly talk about the statutory model, because this is Canada. Canada is an example of this one. And this is very different, whereby essentially Canada gets the money that it needs. It doesn't need to really ask for it. It's guaranteed, other than for some additional costs. I don't know if anyone from Canada is here, but it would be interesting if they were, maybe to correct some of our research. But this is where we are at the moment. So just an overview for Canada. Only the salaries of permanent staff are subject to the annual parliamentary approval. But then it's the other costs for election delivery are funded through a statutory authority. So I won't go into too much detail because it's very technical. I would really advise you to have a look at the website if you need to know. I can see from some of your faces that it's a lot to take in, because it was for us when we started this research. But I'll move on now to the final one, actually, which I think is probably the most interesting, probably the most relevant for a lot of countries that don't always get the money that they need. And Liberia is an example of a country which is seeking to establish an escrow account. So a money where an account where money for elections can be held 2 years in advance of the election. So it's guaranteed to have the money for the election. So the National Elections Commission, it's constitutionally autonomous, which is often the case, but it's always faced persistent challenges which undermine this autonomy. It's consistently experienced late disbursement of approved funds, fragmented release of cash, and this has resulted in operational uncertainty. And I think this is, sometimes I feel a bit difficult talking about countries when, who am I? It's a shame we don't have a representative, but I know that I think when we've spoken to the Liberian Election Commission, they'd be very happy for us to talk about their experience. So they've experienced serious problems with procurement, implementing voter education programs, and this has eroded their public confidence. So what they've decided to do is establish this dedicated escrow account. An alternative, so I'll try and keep this very brief. It's an account where money is placed before an election and then the election commission can take it as it needs. There is an alternative model which some other countries are looking at, namely Liberia, Nigeria, Sierra Leone, Nigeria and Kenya, where it would be a trust fund. And that would be essentially where money is placed and it's held for a longer period. And the key point of these funds, as I said, is that they're placed in the fund in advance of the electoral cycle. And this would allow for clear disbursement of funds when they need it. And it also enhances transparency. So there seems this appetite for new ways to support sustainable finance. And I think in many ways it's just, we're not at the start of the journey, but these are new developments. So as I say, the topic is not new, but it's gained momentum in the last couple of years, or maybe the last 10 years. And this is an example of it. So, in order not to take too much more time, now I'll just go on to the final section of the presentation, and I'll talk about the costs. So trying to actually place a cost on an activity is impossible. And also it's futile in many senses. Well, futile is maybe too extreme, but it doesn't really help the cause. So what's a better way of looking at things is understanding what costs are and then maybe where they will sit within what does, I wouldn't say doesn't need to be provided, but maybe what's a secondary, so when funds are under pressure, what can be a secondary rather than primary expenditure? So there are 4 types of costs that we've identified. Well, that exists. We can't take all the. So International IDEA is one organisation that's working on this, and there are 4 types of costs. So there are the core costs, which are fixed, unavoidable, and they're required for an EMB just to function. And this covers things like staff time, the salaries, the voter registers, and core IT systems. Also, compliance. I mean, it's something that's not always considered, but it should be, because it affects accountability and transparency across an EMB's function. And that leads to the next cost, which is an integrity cost. And these are resources that are required to ensure elections are credible and trusted. So, for example, this can be audits, dispute resolution, but also increasingly, as we know, this is a problem everywhere, is essentially supporting protection of the information environment. And that would be attacks against the EMB, but also related to voter education. And then there are direct costs. So these are the most visible expenses, and this is what we see on election day. So it's polling staff, ballot papers, all the logistics, and the hiring of polling stations. And then there are diffuse costs. So this would be sometimes aspects of an election that we don't consider even to be related to an election, but they're crucial. So this would be security, judicial processes around disputes or any other aspects, and then also support from other agencies. So as we can see, and why is this relevant? For policymakers, too often it's not understood that all these costs are part of an election, and this is why this is something that we hope to kind of highlight in our research in our handbook. So finally, I'll speak to you quickly about some of the cost drivers. And this is another important, so for the topic of sustainable finance, I mean, we really need to look at what are driving these costs. So often, as you can see from the slide, so there's inflation and population growth. And sometimes an EMB's budget can just go, well, if they receive the same again next year, immediately it's too small. So also, the last couple of years, inflation has just not been so predictable. And this has been a problem for some EMBs in some countries as costs have just got out of control. Another key cost driver is the implementation of special voting arrangements. So postal voting, more and more countries are seeking to enhance inclusion and participation. And one of the ways of doing this is through postal voting. But of course, there's a huge cost attached to this. And then there's also the increasing use of technology and the costs that come with this. This brings me to the end of the presentation. I know that there was a lot of information in there, a lot of technical information, a lot of information that maybe hopefully you just understood you got the kind of a taste for some of the things. And I think if any of it's deemed relevant or of interest, I really encourage you to go to our International IDEA's website. We will be doing more research on this. It will be enhanced this year. And I'll leave it there. Thank you. And now I will pass to Elvish Julie from the Seychelles Commission.
Good morning, everybody. My presentation will be mainly to discuss some of the financial challenges that we as an electoral management body faces when it comes to elections and managing of election in Seychelles. Now, I'll be very brief. I'll talk a little bit about the short-term financial challenges, a bit on the long-term financial challenges, and how the budget system impedes on independence and efficiency. Now, I've listened to my colleagues here, and I can resound that some of the issues that are faced by a number of countries that has been mentioned are pretty much similar everywhere. And Seychelles is not an exception. Now, the Seychelles Electoral Commission is a constitutional body responsible for election, voter registration, civic education, and political party oversight. Now, in our constitution, it is enshrined in our constitution that the Electoral Commission shall not be subject to the direction or control of any person or authority in performance of its function. So this is in the highest law of the land. But what do we see on the ground in actuality? We find that as an election management body, we report to the Ministry of Finance and the National Assembly, and we must, on a yearly basis, submit a budget, annual budget, like any other government institution. And our funding is basically, like I say, from the national budget. The Commission prepares the budget, sends it to the ministry annually. And for the election, when the year of election, the specific cost for election, such as the actual election operation, these are funded by a consolidated revenue fund. Okay, so we are in principle accountable to the Ministry of Finance for use of funds, and we are audited by the Auditor General. So this poses some short-term financial challenges for us. Okay, first of all, it affects our ability to function effectively for current and upcoming operation. It ties up your hands. And the annual budget, it causes annual budget delays and rigid, in view of the rigid government cycle. So, for example, we need to follow the government's budget cycle with proposal, review, and approval phase that can disperse the money. The money is dispersed quarterly, not in a lump sum, and you can't use it as you need to use it when you want to use it. Okay? This can impact timely procurement. For example, procurement of electoral materials, staff training, preparation for imminent election before the election year. This poses a lot of problem for us. It also poses human resource funding restriction. For example, although the budget line exists for staffing, approval to recruit is dependent on the Public Service Authority, which is another body. Okay? They have to evaluate whether you really need to have this position, and they need to get the permission of the Ministry of Finance before so. For example, posts that has been allocated in budget sometimes cannot be filled immediately due to these evaluation delays. So this limits electoral staffing capacity even when funds are available. So these are some of the issues, short-term issues that we find really affects us a lot. I will briefly talk about the long-term issues. Okay, so these relate to the Commission's sustainability and resilience over the medium term and the long-term planning and predictability in financial difficulty that we have. For example, one of the issues that we face is linked to infrastructure and technology investments. There is no provision for a modern voter registration system because the money is not there for an IT system, infrastructure that does not exist in the existing budget. They have what we call a zero budgeting system. Every year you get the same money. And you need to make do with what you get. So in terms of this, it is difficult to have a multi-year planning in that sense. Because the budget is annual, aligning with the government processes, making long-term planning and predictability financial investment difficult for us. We cannot invest on have long-term investment, such as voters database, upgrade or the digital tools that we need and we require. This is difficult to secure money for these things. So in the context of Seychelles is a group of islands. So running election is costly, despite the fact that we are a small country, because we have to freight planes, helicopters, to bring voting to all these remote little islands. And this can have a very high logistical cost over time. So while constitutionally we are independent, several features of the central budgeting system weaken the practical autonomy of our organization. It makes life extremely difficult. So looking forward, we've proposed to make forward some recommendation on how we can deal with these standing issues. For example, we would like to see a shift towards independent budgeting authority, where we can advocate for direct parliamentary approval of the electoral budgets as recommended by global best practices to enhance impartiality. And we also would like to introduce a multi-year budgeting, establish a multi-year budgeting for long-term plans, for example, for IT, infrastructure, etc. So these are the things that we want to do. And we need to create a reserve line. We've spoken about an account here, a reserve line for emergent operational needs. For example, late legislation amendments, consultant reviews. This is not available for the moment. So in conclusion, I would say that the challenges are quite clear and important. The Electoral Commission of Seychelles do operate with constitutional independence. There's no question about that. But the budgetary dependence on the central government processes limits the functional autonomy and the operational efficiency of our institution. Addressing short-term delays in funding, long-term investment gaps, and enhancing budgetary autonomy are critical to ensure credible, efficient, and trustworthy election. I thank you.
Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. So now we're going to go to our next speaker, Shubhra Saxena from the ECI. Thank you.
Thank you, Oliver. This walk to the lectern has perhaps been, I was dreading walking towards this side to speak to all of you because I have been watching your faces for the past almost an hour. And to be the last speaker in this panel, and speaking of finance, I can see your faces, you're all bored to death. And that's why my talk, is going to be about why finance is important, why we should not be feeling sleepy right now, why we should be very, very alert, because democracy's most visible thing is, what is it? Elections. And what is invisible is the cost of elections. And that's how I will try to start my presentation and give you the real perspective why I chose this as a topic to speak on. Even though as an organizer, I saw it was going towards the end of the conference. Looking at your faces, I thought perhaps it should have been timed a little earlier before the fatigue sets in and people lose the perspective of why we are sitting in this conference. But my job here is to make you wake up and understand why this reality needs to be looked at again and again in your countries across the globe. Because as Therese told me, told all of you, like EMBs, how they were named, and they started looking at elections, financing. And I remember 2023 when I was in Stockholm, there was a workshop on protecting elections framework. And I am quite embarrassed to say this, that my worldview was so limited. Being in India, being part of ECI, having been a field officer conducting elections, never any dearth of money. And when I heard some EMBs say, we did not get the funding, I was like, is that even possible? Is it a reality? Is it something that happens in this world? How can an EMB not get funds? And I was quite surprised. And that's where my perspective shifted. Why are we talking about protecting elections? The biggest threat to elections is not cyber hacking, is not all of those things, violence, is the absence of funds. This is the single most important threat to elections and hence to democracy. And that's why we all need to look at it more seriously and not get bored. I know finance is boring, but we all earn to eat. And elections also require money. That's the food for elections. And if elections are gone, I don't know what will happen to states. So with that perspective, I think you'll be more alert now when we talk about cost of elections and the different financing models, because when I didn't know that this is actually a reality where EMBs do not get funds, I lived in a fool's paradise, because in India, we have never had a problem. Election Commission is backed by the Constitution. Even in the Constitution itself, there are a lot of things that are given to Election Commission by way of powers to, which I'll explain later in my presentation. So then you lose sight of what is bothering the rest of the world, because your perspective is so limited. And then this reality is something we need to understand is so serious. If elections do not happen, what would countries do? Failed states. So the cost of elections, ladies and gentlemen, direct election costs and indirect election costs. What do we mean by direct election costs? I know Oliver is an expert, so he had to explain it to you in very technical terms. I am a practitioner. I will try to explain it to you in a way that you understand. And because this issue is so relevant in today's times, and if we do not understand what goes into an election, why do we need to think about this? So first you need to understand what exactly is the cost of elections. core administration of an election management body, the salary that I get, and my colleague is sitting here, the head of IT, she spends a lot of time on IT. Our core work is so significant, but then beyond the core, how do you conduct elections? Elections do not happen in a vacuum. We have one chief electoral officer sitting here. He conducted elections in a state just last year. Mammoth exercise. You have so many people working. You have so many vehicles. You have to requisition sometimes choppers, sometimes boards. And where does all that come from? It's not a vacuum. Suddenly things will appear out of nowhere and elections will happen on their own. Big logistical exercise. The conduct of elections is such a mammoth cost that if we don't think about it, then when you want to conduct elections, you might not have the money. So that is very, very important. Now, indirect election costs, what we fail to look at: security, transport, local administration, even people who are maintaining law and order, people who are protecting elections, like we use a lot of security. We do not want anybody to ever say anybody was able to influence elections. Where does that cost come from? I mean, these are things that are so beyond our eyes. We are not able to get visibility of these costs, but these are actual costs. And public broadcasting, these things we do not understand. We have a media team, we have a social media team, we are fighting misinformation, disinformation. There's so many new challenges that are coming today. So who pays for that? And if you don't think about these costs, so as the line says it aptly, the cost of conducting elections is democracy's operating expenditure. And the financing model, the kind of financing that we have for EMB, can actually predict the protection of democracy or diminishing of it. So this is about cost of elections. Now let's look at the contemporary world. What is the reality? Today, you see the scale of elections has magnified so much. I would like to say election is not a one-time event. That, okay, we are having elections today, it's over. Election is an everyday exercise now. Every day, round the clock. So why are we looking at it as a discrete phenomenon? And it is not even something that is separate from regular governance. It is so deeply entrenched in our regular administration that we have to stop looking at elections as a discrete standalone activity. It is, you are revising electoral rolls every day, you're fighting. So for example, even in my country, we keep having so much of misinformation about how we conduct elections on EVM. So something or other would keep cropping up related to disputes in courts. Where does that money come from? How do we pay those lawyers? I think some of the lawyers who are coming to this conference must be sitting here. Where does that come from? So due to so many structural drivers, if you see, scale and logistics have increased, and then technology. Now we have to use technology in a massive way, and we all know technology is expensive. Inclusion mandates, all of us at all the EMBs are trying to include marginalized sections. People who might not be able to vote, might not be able to get a voice if the EMBs do not intervene. That requires additional efforts beyond the normal, beyond the traditional. So when you want to do that, it increases costs. Then legal complexity, as we know that EMBs keep getting dragged to courts in so many matters. Citizens or anybody can have an issue with one of our electoral processes. They might say we are doing some hanky-panky. That's because we are accountable to people. Of course, that is our job. As election management bodies, we have to answer to the public. So when they drag us to courts, so those costs increase, and day by day, people are getting more and more litigating. They are getting into litigation. And then information integrity. Again, response to misinformation and disinformation, that is a challenge worldwide. And as we have seen in 2024, most of you know, and we have already been discussing it in multiple sessions, world witnessed the largest amount of elections, the largest number of elections. And there was so much of misinformation traveling. And because of ICT, sorry, I don't hate you for that. I mean, you are from IT, but so much of technology, every Tom, Dick and Harry can have access to any kind of information, distort it and spread it like wildfire. The access of someone to any kind of information in any part of the world is unlimited now, unfettered, unlimited. And that kind of puts so much of pressure on EMPs to actually deal with it. Because misinformation has a way of vitiating elections. Your elections are totally gone if that is the governing narrative, what people are trying to create through misinformation. And security for elections. It could be cyber security, it could be from violence, polarization, threats to officials. All kinds of risks are there. So those are the costs. Now, here is an indicative graph where I'm trying to show you the kind of costs countries incurred while conducting elections. So you see India, US, Indonesia, and Australia. I have not taken other countries, otherwise it would have become a lot of information. These figures are indicative, and if you look at the figure for India, $16.25 billion. That's the cost of our elections. US 16 billion. Indonesia 4 billion. Where is this money coming from? But in my country, I think it's a blessing that Election Commission has never had dearth of resources. The more we want, the more we get. There has never been a situation where the executive or the legislature ever said, oh, Election Commission is spending way too much. I think this is the spending that democracy demands. And if we do not do it, then democracy withers. So this is an indication of the kind of, India is highest here, than US. And if we look at sometimes people try, and I think Oliver must have already, they've been doing that as part of their framework, the cost per elector. And while cost efficiency might be a virtue in general management, but I think that should not be a factor. There are, so as I'll explain to you later, cost efficiency is good, but at what cost? So we have to be efficient. If we are taking technology, that technology should be sustainable for that EMB. If I'm doing it today, I should be able to use it tomorrow. And if I am trying to take that technology today and tomorrow I won't be able to maintain that continuity, then that expenditure is gone. So countries are very, very unique. India is not like Seychelles, the kind of challenges they face, because they were just talking about islands and transportation. So every country is unique. Financing is also going to be unique to the country. But then we cannot say, oh, per elector cost is high, so this country is efficient. Per elector cost is high, so this country is inefficient. Low means good. There has to be a sustainable cost per elector for that country. So any kind of model that comes out with a theory that cost efficiency per elector is an indicator of an EMB being efficient, I would disagree with that. This is how we have been progressing. If you look at 2019 elections, the cost was 8.52 billion. In 5 years, it is double that amount. And I think by 29, I don't know, 30 billion. Because the way scaling up is happening, the way technology, the challenges we are facing, now we are seeing foreign intervention in elections. They're trying to influence electoral processes in different countries. I mean, so yes, I had noted it down. Sorry, Oliver, I forgot. He compared election spending to military spending, and I completely agree with that. I think a country needs to mark their election expenditure as the military expenditure. It is equivalent. Military might be able to protect you from invasions and incursions, but if your elections are gone, if you don't spend on military, of course, the country can be invaded. But if you don't protect elections, if you don't fund in elections, then everything is gone. There is no country to protect anymore. It's chaos. It's a failed state. So I think it's even more important than military, is what I'm trying to emphasize. So these are technical terms Oliver has already discussed and Therese has already explained to you. It needs to be predictable. I try to explain things from a layman's perspective because I'm not an expert. I'm a practitioner. What is predictability? I should know that tomorrow, okay, so in life, predictability is I know that I will have a house tomorrow. I have a roof over my head. I will have bread on my table. That is predictability of life. So I'm not insecure. Likewise, EMBs also need predictable financing. The financing needs to be predictable, that when we need funds, we will get them. That predictability, if it's ingrained into the system, perfect. If it's not, the countries have to really evaluate their financing models and see how well they fare on the predictability part. I think this is the most important thing. It should be independent. What do we mean by independent financing? How can it be independent? Of course, independence means that it cannot be influenced through partisan politics. Today, if EMB takes a decision and the party in power suddenly decides, oh, we don't like them, let's not give them funds to do this exercise. They're trying to do something that goes against us. They should not be able to do that. That's the second most significant thing. It should be adequate. It should be commensurate with the demands of EMBs. And if it's not adequate, EMBs won't be able to do their jobs, right? It should be resilient. When I say resilient, I mean, because these are words, technical jargons. What is resilience? Resilience is the ability to withstand stress of any kind. So let's say there is a sudden need to do something because of a certain challenge. We should be able to deal with it. So the financing needs to be having inbuilt resilience. So I need 100 crores for elections, but suddenly there is a challenge and I need 10 crores. That cushion should be there. That resilience of the EMB should be there, not just enough to get by, but to be prepared to deal with any kind of challenge, any kind of adversity that comes in front of the EMB. And it needs to be transparent and accountable. Like any public body, EMBs should get finances, but they should be accountable to legislature. In India, we have that accountability built in. I'll show you that. But underfunding, undermining electoral integrity. I'm trying to show you what happens if you don't fund EMBs properly, if you don't fund elections properly. First thing is outdated systems. Times are moving ahead. EMBs might fall far behind. What that will result into? Hardware glitches, EVM malfunctions, slow tallying. And what will be the consequences? Failures and delays and loss of public confidence in the result. What happens to that then? If funds are not sufficient, understaffing. Understaffing, not enough people to do the job. Overworked poll workers, poor crowd management, and procedural errors. So we do not want that. Election has to be a fail-safe operation. We want adequate number of people. And if we do not have funds, we will not be able to have adequately trained, adequate number of people who are trained so well, because it needs to work it needs to go like clockwork, not a miss. One thing goes amiss, your elections are challenged. So weak cybersecurity, again, we have spoken about foreign interventions and vulnerability of electoral systems to hacking. And then once the system gets hacked, it is not something that is a one-time event. The result is a cascading wave of loss of public trust in electoral processes. We have heard examples of many countries going the electronic route, where they introduced internet voting, and then they had to backtrack. In India, a lot of times, people ask us, why do you use EVM? We have moved to ballot papers. Why? First of all, our voting is not the electronic in the real sense. It is more like a calculator, which is disconnected from any other kind of machine or network. So it basically just tabulates the number of votes polled. It is not electronic in the electronic sense. So when they ask us these questions and why we are not moving so far ahead with technology, oh, we have the best technology in my country, but we are like, okay, we will focus on technology forming the bulwark around our elections. But as far as voting goes, so people have adopted technologies and taken a rollback because people lost trust. Trust is what protects elections. And once trust is gone, it's very, very difficult to bring it back. Poor training, if your polling personnel, the people who are conducting elections, they're not properly trained, then there'll be errors, there will be procedural lapses. And what that does, again, electoral integrity suffers. Your elections get attacked. People say there's something wrong that is happening because of errors and delays. So models, Oliver already showed you there are multiple models in the world about how EMBs are financed. And I think they are self-explanatory. Executive controlled annual appropriations, parliamentary or legislative insulated appropriations, statutory and automatic funding, multi-year baseline plus surge funding, and donor-supported election financing. Now, out of all of this, I think the most dangerous would be Model A and Model E. I mean, B, C, and D, I think they are still somewhere in middle of the spectrum. Why I say that Model A and Model B are the most dangerous? Why are they the most insecure form of financing? First, if the executive controls election funding, if the executive is able to tell the EMB that I'm not giving funds to you, everything goes for a toss. So it needs to be independent of the executive. Why Model E? I don't need to repeat myself. External donation to election has a way of getting into electoral integrity. Foreign intervention is something, I mean, we don't take any foreign funding. We don't even allow our political parties to take any foreign donations. So foreign funding of elections, of course, many countries need it. It is the need of the hour. They are not self-sufficient, but they should try. They should try to have some kind of sustainable model of financing. And that's why I can't stress it enough. This being the most boring topic is the most relevant topic today. And countries need to move towards self-reliance. They need to look at models. They need to talk to their governments, civil society, and develop models to become self-reliant in terms of financing of their elections. These are the figures. I already showed you 16 billion we spent. And if you look at around 1 billion voters, these many polling stations, these many personnel we use, and we have a very vast and diverse geographic and cultural terrain. I mean, we have all kinds of ethnicities, we have all kinds of people, we have oceans, we have cold desert, we have hot desert, we have mountains, we have valleys, we have all kinds of regions. And it amazes me that election commission spends whatever is required to reach even the last voter. And it's very interesting, and I feel quite proud of it. We have polling stations for even one voter. And there are parts of our country where the polling party with the security, with the machines, goes to that polling station where only one resident is there. And there are multiple such places. And it makes me feel so proud. Even in the remotest places, we send people through our Air Force choppers. We send people, sometimes they have to trek for days to reach the polling station. But there is not one place in this country where people can't vote. And that requires money. This is the bottom line. If you want to have proper elections and give every citizen of your country the ability to voice their opinion, cast their vote, and feel involved, it will require money. So we are a constitutionally established authority, and our constitution is very interesting. And I've just put Article 324(6) of the Constitution of India. You know what it says? It says that I'm not going to say the exact words. It basically means that the state government or the central government shall is the operative word, shall provide to the election commission any personnel required for conducting elections. So what that does, the entire machinery of the state, entire machinery of the central government, be it paramilitary forces, anyone, we can take services, we don't have to request anyone. All we have to say, we need these many people from your organization, send them to us. And that kind of power is huge. So our constitution makers knew that elections will be a big logistical exercise. And that's why it is inbuilt in our constitution. So a lot of money we get through our constitution itself. And rest of it, we have a parliamentary system of government. Our parliament approves the budget of ECI, and that expenditure is audited by the parliament. We are under constant scrutiny. Of course, they give us all the funds, but we are always accountable to the parliament. So they look at us, our reports are audited, our funds are audited, how we spend them. And at the end of the day, like any public office in India, Election Commission is also accountable to the parliament. So what can we do? What can EMBs do? They need to relook at the budget architecture. What kind of budgeting are they doing? Whether it's a multi-year budgeting, whether it is a baseline readiness funding, whether they need cybersecurity investments. Because if they don't do it now, there has to be some internal stock taking in terms of what kind of financing framework an EMB has. So that's the first thing. Procurement reform. Why am I talking about procurement reform? Money not well spent is wasted. EMBs sometimes get funds, and because they are not adopting best practices for procurement, the money goes waste, and then later government will say, or people will say, oh, you waste money. We are not giving you any more money. So EMBs need to adopt the best practices for procurement, because if they do not, they have to get value for money. So some poor countries who are not that resource rich should actually evaluate the cost of technology they're adopting. Maybe 1 year they can do it, 2 years, will they be able to sustain it for a third year? So that kind of a long-term prediction, there has to be a long-term predictability of anything that you adopt today. So they have to look at their procurement reform and become more efficient. Financial transparency matters. Anything opaque invites distrust. So EMBs need to become more transparent. Trust me, if you become more transparent, people will be more willing to give you money. Any organization which is proactive in disclosing what it does with the money that public gives it will be more credible. So you need to become more financially transparent. If you are not, look at your systems. Why? Because the survival of an EMB, survival of elections depends on us taking stock of where we need to improve. And cost saving without integrity loss, it's not a technical term. It means a lot. Don't save costs if they are impacting integrity. Costs should be saved only where integrity is not affected. And if integrity is taking a hit, do not think twice, spend it. So these are the things I think EMBs should be doing. And I don't see any sleepy faces, so I must be doing a good job. And I would end my presentation. This is a line I really love, and I would read it out to you. A democracy that can fund its elections predictably is a democracy that can renew itself peacefully. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shubhra. So we are at time, but I'm keen to give the audience the opportunity to ask a few questions. So, and I can already see some interest. So maybe we can just take one short round. Yeah, to the gentleman over there.
There's a question. Myself, Additional Secretary, Higher Education, Government of Odisha. I'm an NLNT. This question to Mr. Oliver. While you were talking about the different model of funding, the Kenyan and Nigerian model, you test that the trust should be, that sort of trust should be funded to the EME. So how you can show that you ensure impartiality, that the trust may be forced, later influence the body, governing body. So how can it be? It's true democracy.
Sorry, could I just ask you to repeat the last section of the question? Just there was some noise around me. Sorry.
You are telling about the Kenyan and Nigerian model.
Yes, yes.
That is the model where the trust and trust will fund the EMB.
Yes.
So in democracy, how can you say that if the governing people will come again, the body will come? Who trusted, the trust will trust him. They will undue influence on this body, on the democracy. So how this trust, funding by trust, should not be received by this body?
So, I can answer. Let me. I can provide an answer.
Probably enunciate the question he's asking and ask him to confirm if that's the right question.
So I think you're referring to when I spoke about the trust funds. It's just an account, a mechanism to store the money. So in many ways, it would be isolated, it would be isolated from political interference. So the idea is it should enhance trust. But Shubhra, would you like to?
You are telling about a escrow fund. That is the difference.
For the first fund, where he feels
The escrow fund, yes.
the executive fund, where he feels that that person would have the power to influence elections. So how do you handle that? Is that
Shubhra would like to answer.
I think I'm trying to understand the question. So what you're saying, any kind of model of financing might have inbuilt insecurities, right? So yes, I showed you the 5 models. So like Oliver is an expert. So trust funds also are a mechanism of financing elections. But with every kind of financing model, there are some issues. So, but depending on the country has to choose what works for them. And we cannot have a perfect system. Any system is prone to vulnerabilities and issues where financing can be used as a means of leverage on the EMB to influence them. But I think different models have different vulnerabilities.
Thank you. So in order not to eat into the next session, we've got time for one more question. If anybody has a question, anybody from the panel? No? Okay, thank you very much. Let's go and get some tea.